All right, so once again, thanks everybody for jumping on and being with us tonight. Glad to have Diondra and Shyam join me for this. What we're really looking to do is answer some questions, some of which have been submitted ahead of time, some of which have been submitted anonymously, about the difference between the party, the coordinated, the campaigns, outside groups, caucuses, and all the fun things that in organizations that we deal with in politics. This isn't meant to be a blame game. This isn't meant to figure out what happened. This is meant to talk about the mechanics of politics and political organizations. My name is Trevor Southerland. I'm currently the executive director of the Pennsylvania House Democratic Campaign Committee. I've worked campaigns in Tennessee, Georgia, Michigan, Virginia, and now Pennsylvania. And I'm glad to be here. I'm the former executive director of the Virginia House Democratic Caucus. Tonight, I'm just here in my personal capacity, not here representing the organization I work for or anybody else. Diondra?
Thanks, Trevor. Hi, everyone. My name is Diondra Musgrave. I've worked on campaigns since 2011, mostly within the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I've also worked in Maryland and have staffed a U.S. Senate campaign in New Jersey. I am the former interim director for the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, and I have worked with Trevor on a number of occasions with the Joint Caucus, coordinated with the Virginia Democrats. And so a lot of my perspective is going to be coming from working as a staffer, as well as a managerial position in terms of coordinating between caucuses. But as Trevor said, I am not speaking in any capacity of representing any of my former or current employers. And I am currently at the University of Richmond as a law student, so I'm also not speaking in that capacity as well.
Hey everybody, I'm Shyam. I'm the party's political director, so here in Virginia. I've been, I guess, a political staffer probably since 2013, which was my first campaign, starting on a Senate race in Iowa. Done campaigns in Iowa, Nebraska, and I've been in Virginia ever since 2015 at the state party. So I think I'm up there with Brenner among the longer serving DPVA employees. And as everyone said, and I did not plan my own disclaimer, but I'm just here in my own happy kitchen.
Great. So like I said, we have a list of questions that we want to go through. And then obviously, if you guys have questions that add on to where we are or more later, we're glad to answer those as well. So these are going in no particular order, but one we have is who gets paid? How do they get paid? Is it salary, percentages, etc.? What do they get paid? That's a very good question. And the answer is it really depends campaign to campaign. There are some campaigns where nobody gets paid. It's an all volunteer effort. There are other campaigns where a lot of people get paid. For example, a presidential. To answer the bigger questions, hopefully all the full-time staff are paid. Hopefully they are paid on a W-2, not a 1099. 1099 is what you pay an independent contractor. That would be like a consultant or somebody that you hire on the outside. W-2 is what you pay a staffer. It used to be a lot more common for campaigns to pay everybody in 1099s. That's now been taken away a lot. There are still some that do it, but they shouldn't unless it's a consultant. Then you have mail vendors, media vendors, which are TV and radio and sometimes digital, and then sometimes you have separate digital vendors, and then a whole world of other consultants that you could be involved with. Typically, media vendors are paid a commission. So typically it's a percentage of whatever you're doing in TV buys or radio buys, and that is either negotiated by the campaign or sometimes ahead of time. For example, a lot of times legislative caucuses will have a preferred vendor list, and they'll negotiate those rates ahead of time. Mail vendors are typically paid a per piece rate. and it's different depending on the vendor, different depending on the size of the company. It varies greatly, but it's negotiated with either the campaign or the caucus or committee that's managing that. Other consultants get paid various amounts. Again, there's not really one set rate. It depends on what they bring to the campaign and what the campaign team or manager or candidate thinks they bring to the campaign. Diondra and Shyam, anything to add to that?
Yeah, really quick. So I've been paid both as a W-2 and a 1099. And one thing that I quickly discovered with the 1099 is you do need to pay your taxes out of it. And so one thing that was told to me by a lot of staffers and people who had really gone into consulting for themselves was to open an LLC and then take your check and deposit it into the LLC. And that way you still have to pay taxes. There's like a misnomer that people think like, oh, if I open, if I start an LLC and I pay myself that way, I don't have to pay taxes. That's not true. You do have to pay taxes, but it's not going to be as significant. And that's particularly helpful when you are taking on a small paycheck. That was a mistake I learned early in my career. I saw for a very low salary, and I was paying. I didn't do it through the LLC method. I was paying directly, and so a large portion of my very small paycheck was going to taxes. So I would highly recommend, if you are put in a situation where you you're talking about your payment, and you're trying to figure out whether you want to be on a W-2 or a 1099, I would highly suggest being a part of a team that is going to put you on a W-2, because to take on that personal task of having to honestly guess your taxes and then pay that out of pocket is just added stress. And we all know campaigns are already stressful enough. So definitely I would lean towards that structure instead of signing as an independent contractor. But I know that's not always the case, but that's just my 2 cents.
The only other thing I'd add is one of the awesome things about politics is just how transparent a lot of this is. So like if you're curious who's getting paid by a campaign or by a party or anything, you can more often than not find all that, whether it's on the FEC's website or at least here in Virginia, VPAP or the State Board of Elections are really good at making sure that all that is transparent information.
Next question we have, which is a very good one, also a little, I'm not sure I know all the answers, but it asks, what is the difference between a distributed, a consolidated, and a coordinated campaign? I've never actually heard of a campaign called a distributed campaign. I Googled it, and that is apparently what you call a campaign run from the bottom up. So I guess, in my opinion, any good campaign has a back and forth model. You should be hearing from your field organizers and your volunteers on the ground all the way up to your campaign manager and consultants, because you need to have a feedback loop to figure out, is what we're seeing in data what you're seeing on the ground, and back and forth. I have heard coordinated campaigns called consolidated campaigns by some people. So my guess is that's the same thing. A coordinated campaign happens almost every year, and that is typically where the top of the ticket will coordinate with all the other campaigns on the ballot to run an effort that is supposed to help everybody. One of the things that I sometimes say, and Shyam may disagree with me, I'm not sure, state parties are often set up to be shells. It is very hard to fundraise at a state party. I've done it before. I know it can be very hard. So a lot of times what you have at a state party is the top of the ticket comes in and sets up the coordinated. In Virginia, for example, that means every year you have a different looking campaign. I think next year it's federal elections, but there's no statewide. This year had a governor's as the top of the ticket. In 19, there was no top of the ticket. It was just House and Senate. So that's how the coordinated campaigns are set up. Sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't, but it depends on sort of who's in charge and what the main objectives of that coordinated campaign are and what resources they have to achieve those objectives. Shyam, anything to add? And then Diondra.
I'd just say, one of the reasons that they do get run through the parties is partly we have a huge infrastructure that's built for payroll, human resources, in recent years for negotiating union contracts. And then in federal years, especially, there's a campaign finance incentive because there are no limits on federal transfers between national and state level party committees. And then there are different laws for how party committees are able to coordinate with individual campaigns without exceeding a campaign finance limit. But I do have to shout out one of our finance team members working hard, raising money for a state party, doing great on that, proving that it's tough, but it is definitely possible. And that's all I got on that one.
Diondra, anything to add on that one from your perspective?
No, I think you all covered that really well.
Cool. I think this next question was written with Shyam in mind, so I think I'll let him take the first crack at this, and then I'll follow up if I don't like his answer. But it's Shyam, can you give a very quick explanation of what the Central Committee is and what is their role within the DPVA?
I have never been known to give a quick explanation of anything. But I'll do my best. The Central Committee is the governing body of the Democratic Party. At its whole, it is the body that elects the chair. It decides what methods of nomination we use for statewide candidates. It adopts the rules for our delegate selection process in a presidential year. And beyond that, it's split into 11 different congressional district committees who govern the Democratic Party within an individual congressional district. So determining the methods of nomination for congressional candidates, overseeing the local committees in their jurisdiction, and also like part of the method of nomination part is that's who candidates file with. So for statewide candidates, they file with the state board, but ultimately they're certified to get on the ballot by the party chair. For congressional districts, they file with the congressional district chair. And then there's a different process further on down the line. It's about as brief as I can be.
I think that was good. I think one thing that is a pet peeve of mine that you see a lot online is people talk about party insiders. And one of the things that you figure out is that a lot of the time when you're talking about party insiders, who you're actually talking about is our grassroots volunteers who are out in their communities doing the hard work. Everybody has an opportunity to run for the Central Committee. There's reorganizations that happen. You get active through your county party, you go to your congressional district convention, you can get elected to the Central Committee. I know anybody can get elected because I was elected to it. And if I can get elected to something, anyone else can. But so a lot of times when you're talking about things that are happening within the party and with nominations, it's those people who are doing the work and ultimately making the decisions. The party also has a steering committee, officers such as the chair, as Shyam mentioned, and then there's the staff who do the day-to-day work and then report back to the volunteers who are on the committee. So it's a large thing. The other thing to keep in mind, every state is a little bit different. In Michigan, we had party dues. You had to pay to be a member of the party. In Pennsylvania, we have registration. In Virginia, you don't have either of those. So, it's a little different everywhere you go. But the general format is the same. And the next question, which I'll also let Shyam take the first crack at here, is how do state party chairs get elected?
So this process is actually coming up for us probably in January, February, March of this year. But essentially, we re-elect every member of the Central Committee once every 4 years. That starts with local caucuses to elect delegates to a congressional district convention. Those delegates at the CD convention then elect the base 20 members of each congressional district committee. Those 20 members then elect 4 additional folks, making sure that we're giving at least 3 spots to city county committees and reserving 1 spot for a general assembly member. And then once all of those 11 conventions have been completed and you have that those 11 different groups of 24 people, they get added together with certain party leaders, so DNC members, the congressional delegation, House and Senate leadership, and they come together to form the Central Committee. And then this should be sometime in early to mid-March of next year. The Central Committee will vote on who the officers are. So the chair, the vice chair of organization, outreach, finance, technology, rules, and then a secretary and treasurer of the party. And at every stage of this, anyone is able to file, provided I'd have to read the party plan on this, but provided that they're a registered voter in the Commonwealth.
And then the next question, and Diondra, I think I'll let you take the first shot at this one if you're good with it, is what resources should local Democratic committees have ready and available to assist campaigns each election cycle?
That's a really loaded question. I mean, I think for the most part, what usually, in my experience, what's happened is there are folks based in a lot of the local committees that have been working on campaigns for years. So you have a lot of really good institutional knowledge, people who have an understanding of what it's going to take to, in terms of reach your field targets. When it comes to fundraising, people tend to have a really good idea of who the top donors are, who the frequent donors are. And as Shyam mentioned earlier, Virginia campaigns are really fortunate in the sense of a lot of this information is, I won't say easily accessible, but it's accessible. In a lot of other states, you don't have VPAP, which is a website you can go to and look up just about everything you would ever want to know, maybe without the exception of actual contact information, but you can get names and frequency of donations. And so I think a lot of the local areas should and often do have these things at the ready. But what I find, and this may be pivoting a little bit, I think what can tend to happen is people tend to go into campaigns with the mindset that there is a one size fits all and we can replicate this each and every campaign cycle. And to some extent that's true, but largely it's a trial by fire type of thing. And so you have to go in with the mindset that you are going to scrap. And if you don't know exactly where to go, it's going to take you, a little bit of stumbling to get there. But there is no magic. Like there's no magic to campaigns. Like if I do this set of things, this is going to be the result each and every time. It's a little bit of science and it's a whole lot of luck. And so the biggest thing I say is reach out. Like you kind of need to figure out what it is you need. And then you need to go to these committees and say, hey, we're running low on volunteers. What can you all do to assist us in this effort? And then they'll be able to, tell you what they have the capacity or bandwidth to do. But to say, what should the committees have on hand? I don't know if I can really answer that. It's really assessing what you're going to need moving forward in the campaign. And you're going to have to check in and probably shift your strategy. What you start in the beginning of the campaign is not what's going to carry you all the way through. So as you assess and figure out what it is you need to be relaying that to your local committee and communicating with them what you need. And then in my experience, they work very hard and diligently to meet you, to help you meet your goal. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, and I also think, one thing to throw in about county committees, just like every campaign, just like every state party, every county committee is a little bit different. There are some county committees that are flush with cash, that have donors that are willing to help fund things, and there's others that don't have anything. So there's always a disparity when it comes to that. I think the biggest thing that I would say is, as much as you can reasonably afford, to look at what things does campaigns in your county need that they may not have the resources for. I lived in Hanover County for several years. Hanover County is famous for many things, but most of which is the Tea Party signs that litter every road in the county. Our county committee knew we had to put up some large Democratic sign to counter those, because they're everywhere and they're demoralizing to people. So our county committee made that a priority. We also made it a priority to make sure that we had money set aside for the campaigns that we could give for them to do what they needed to do. So we tried to do a little bit of both. But I think it's just really having a consistent, this is what the county committee is going to do, so that as candidates come along, they sort of know what the county committee is going to be there for. Shyam, anything to add to that one?
I think it's also really important for campaigns to always be in communication with their county committees, because ultimately, as Diondra said, like, not every campaign has the same needs. Not every, and Trevor, like, not every county committee has the same ability to help, and so you really just have to constantly be in communication with folks. And I think you also have to look at the county committee as the top Democratic activists in any individual locality. They're the ones who are frankly in charge of the Democratic Party there. And so, for help with, whether it's volunteers or, here's a staging location that you should use, here's a list that we've had from previous cycles. The best way to know what's available and to know what you need is to just be in communication with them. And that's true from in every single locality in Virginia.
A question from the chat is, how differently is the Republican Party organized from the Democratic Party? Do they follow the same central committee, congressional committee structure? Do they have coordinated campaigns? Some of that I can answer and then pass off to the other two if they have things to add. They are organized in a similar fashion. Their central committee, I can't remember exactly what they call it in Virginia. Everybody has different names for a central committee, but theirs, if memory serves, is a lot smaller than the Democratic Central Committee in Virginia. I remember watching some wonderful, wonderful reality television shows of them choosing how they were going to rig their nomination process. And it was a smaller group, but it was their full committee. So they have a lot less people involved. They are organized by the congressional districts. One thing that I'll say about the main difference that I've seen between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans tend to be much more consultant heavy. And I know there's some people that are going to watch this that are probably going to gasp at that because they think Democratic politics is consultant heavy. Democrats tend to have more staffers. We tend to have more day-to-day people, whereas Republicans tend to have more consultants. When I ran the Virginia House Caucus, we had about 12 staffers on the ground for the Virginia House Caucus, our central staff. The Republican side had a couple. They had a lot more consultants. They had a lot more heavy on that load. Shyam, do you have others you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I think so. Where we include every member of our congressional district committees as a part of our central committee, they really only have the chairs of their, I think they call them constituency groups. They have a few, they have their RNC members, their national committee people, and then a few General Assembly members. I think it's a total of 72. So they have a much smaller central committee. Like ours is 300 and 15, give or take, on the day. And then, what the structure of their campaigns, I couldn't speak to that. But I think Trevor covered that one.
Next question is, what role does the party have in primaries? And this is, again, a question that can have several different answers. And that's something in politics that you find a lot. The first thing that I'll just say, and this is another thing that I do a lot, is when people say the party, I ask them what they mean by that. Are they talking about party staff? Are they talking about the officers? Are they talking about the Central Committee? Are they talking about everybody who is a member of the Democratic Party? What do you mean by the party? The answer to the question is it differs a little bit in every state. In Virginia, my experience is the party stays out of primaries. The congressional districts determine the method of nomination. In a lot of states, they don't do that. In a lot of states, it's automatically a primary. In Virginia, you can have a primary, a caucus, or a convention. Most recently, I think the Central Committee, while I was on it, actually passed a resolution that said we were supposed to choose primaries as our first method, which is the most open and democratic method. It's the easiest way for the most people to vote. But for the most part, the mechanics of the party stays out of primaries. Now, what individual elected officials do is a different subject matter. Individuals can endorse, they cannot endorse, they can give money and support however they want. So a lot of times people will conflict, say, a sitting governor endorsing someone with the party. And those are two different things. And that's something that we sometimes have to recognize, is that people live in different pots, and you got to figure out which one they're going from with what they're doing. Diondra, Shyam, anything to add?
I would just say it's different in every state. I know in Minnesota, they do hold a convention ahead of their primaries to decide which candidates they're going to endorse. In Virginia, we have, we just decide what method of nomination we're going to use to nominate our candidates, and then we provide the same support to every campaign, whether that's through the voter file. I know in this last cycle, we were the primary drivers of organizing debates for the gubernatorial campaigns, the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, so that they could take that off their plate and focus on talking to voters. We also run a year-round voter protection program that lets us use the primary as a dry run in order to plan for the general election. But it's a line in our party plan that we don't endorse or support any candidate over another until they're officially the nominee. And I think we've been pretty good about that for quite a while here in Virginia.
Our next question is, how do you decide what the campaign's message is? Who decides that? Another great question. Diondra or Shyam, either of you want to take the first crack at this one?
I can go ahead. In my experience, it comes down to the candidate and what they're looking to communicate. If you're in a primary, you want to differentiate yourself from another candidate who is running to represent the same party as you. And so it's a combination of looking at what the district needs, what the constituents are putting at the forefront of their personal platform. And then really what I tend to do is try to look at comprehensive things that can actually be made into legislative proposals, or some sort of action can actually follow up the platform. I have gotten into lively discussions with candidates that I've worked for, in terms of what I thought should be a priority versus what they wanted to be a priority. And frankly, at the end of the day, it is the candidate's name on the banner. So I ultimately went with that. But it depends. Some candidates have a really good idea of what the district needs and what they want. And they are able to really parse out what's going to be a part of their platform. And some people need a little bit more prodding. But it's all really a feedback loop. And I think it's important as staff to go in with that mindset and have a good understanding of, even if you're not from that particular area, it's good to familiarize yourself with what's going on. Because if you don't, that can be really problematic. So going back to an earlier point of touching base with the committees, one thing I would always do is sit down and schedule breakfast with folks who were prominent in the community and just figure out, to learn from them. And I got one of my best mentors, rest in peace, Mr. Al Brooks. That is how him and I formed a relationship. I went to a breakfast anticipating it being an hour tops, definitely ended up there for 4 hours, but it was well worth the time and energy. And you get to build a rapport with the community that way, and that will help you in being staff, because these people need to be able to trust you, and that will then benefit your candidate that you're representing. So a combination of doing research, talking to folks, speaking to the candidate, and really assessing what you think is going to be best for the community that the candidate is looking to represent.
The only thing I have to add is on the second part of the question, who decides the message? It's not Twitter. That's it. I'm just going to mute now.
All right, Twitter, we'll let you attack Shyam later for that one. The only thing I would add to that is that sometimes the message is decided by no factors that we can imagine at the time. Sometimes there are October surprises. Sometimes there are gaffes. Sometimes there are wars or, diseases, viruses, anything like that. So sometimes it's something unpredictable that changes your message. And that's one of the things I always tell campaigns is they've got to be ready to adapt. If you go into a campaign thinking these are the only 3 things, this is it, this is my 3 points, you might run into a problem, because you need to be able to change with what happens throughout the campaign.
I just want to add one thing. It's always really important to remember that the goal of running for office isn't just to get elected. It's to then represent your constituents to the best of your ability, and to make sure that you're being a good, faithful public servant to them. And so, between what you have to do to get elected, the other important part of the message is recognizing what your voters need and what their needs are. And so, getting out of the bubble of the Twitter sphere, the politicos, it's important to talk to all the different people, but ultimately, there's somebody who's really focused on buying a gallon of milk and making sure that you meet them at their front step, and finding what's important to them is also really important there.
So we have 2 more questions that were submitted through the forum, and then we'll open it up if there are other questions that people have on the call. Rural communities with small committees need help. Where and how can we get started to push the Democratic agenda? And I think, definitely Shyam and probably Diondra are going to have some thoughts on this. The thing that I would say to my friends in rural communities, there's a couple of things. One, what are our objectives? And I used to say this a lot. I still say it in Pennsylvania when I'm doing candidate recruitment in rural districts that are often very tough for Democrats to win in. What are the objectives of what we're trying to do? Is it to build the party? Is it to get our message out? Is it to hopefully help build so that we can elect some people to local offices? if you're running in a district that's a R+20 district, the chances of you winning are very slim. So we have to set out, everybody runs a campaign to win, but what are the other objectives of this campaign? What is going to consider it a success, even if we don't win the election? The other thing that I would say is it's about long-term organizing. It's about building up locally, and it's about making sure that you, as a Democratic activist in a rural committee, don't take on too much for yourself. Time and time again, we see, whether it's an activist, whether it's a staffer, people get burnout in politics quick because they take a lot on their shoulders and it just becomes too much and they burn out. I've seen it a lot with local activists that are in rural communities. They want to do everything, and you can't always do that. So you have to be realistic about what you want to achieve as a local committee and what you personally can do to help the local committee achieve that, because we need you in this for the long haul. Rebuilding the Democratic brand in some of these communities is going to take a while, and we need you to be there. So don't let yourself get burnt out. Shyam, Diondra.
I love you just have to define what success is, right? If you define success as winning and losing every year, it is going to weigh on you in a way that will cause burnout. If you define success outside of an electoral context and focus on building a structure, if we had 5 volunteers last year, can we either retain those 5 or build it up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? How can we, Trevor has a lot of conversations with candidates. I do that too. I ask them to do 2 things. Don't disappear, because you're going to learn so much. And then secondly, leave the district in a better place than you found it. And that doesn't always have to be an electoral outcome. It in a lot of cases, and I think we saw this earlier this year with the Senate District 38 special election, where I think we left Senate District 38 in a lot better place than we found it by running a campaign with direct mail pieces, digital ads. I believe we did radio a bit there too, but to give folks in the coal fields in Radford a show of this is what those campaigns look like. Here's how we can organize around a candidate. Here's how we can build those committees in that area through a campaign. And I think we will see long-term success coming out of that. While we came up short in that special election, and again, if we define success as winning and losing, I think we'd look back on that and think it was a failure. But if we define it as engaging the activists, engaging the voters, giving people someone who they can go to the polls and vote for in a proud way and say that they're a Democrat, I think we can also look back and see it as a pretty big success for us.
And then the last pre-submitted question, what is the House Caucus? So I somehow think I'm the person to answer this one, although I'd be glad to give it up to somebody. The House Caucus, I'm going to take this at a state level, but then I'll also talk about it federally just a little bit. When you talk about what a House Caucus or a Senate caucus, oftentimes there are 2 things that you're talking about. One is the actual caucus, and those are the members. So when you say the Virginia House Democratic Caucus, you are talking about the Democrats who have been elected to the House of Delegates. They come together as a group and they elect internal leadership. So every caucus has a different size, whether it's 55 or 48 or 34, whatever size your caucus is, they come together and elect their leadership. Every state has a little bit different. Some states it's leader whip, some states it's leader chair, some states there's all 3, some states have other officers that get mixed in there. In the Senate, you've got President pro temp and all this type of stuff that gets elected. So those are the members. And then often there is a campaign organization. In Pennsylvania, we are the House Democratic Campaign Committee. We are the group that works to elect those people. So we work to defend our incumbents and to add to that group to hopefully help us achieve a majority. So when somebody says House Caucus, they're either talking about the members themselves or they're talking about the campaign organization that is specifically dedicated to this one chamber. On the federal level, if you've heard of the D-TRIP, they only focus on the U.S. House of Representatives. The DSCC only focuses on the United States Senate. So that's the federal version of those. At a state level, we also have the DLCC. There's the Democratic Governors Association, Democratic Attorney Generals Association. There's even a Democratic Secretary of State's Association. The Republican Party has RSLC, which is almost most of those things combined. The governors are separate, but their legislative, LG, Secretary of State, I think they're all under one roof at the RSLC. Anything to add to that one?
I would just say, in addition to that, while a little different in terms of mission, the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus is structured similarly. So there are the actual members that are comprised of both the members of the House of Delegates and the state senators, and they work on legislative agendas and really working to consolidate and put to the forefront legislation that impacts not just the Black community, but other communities of color and the most vulnerable communities in the Commonwealth. In addition to that, there is an arm that is not officially separated because it's not required, but there is a fundraising arm. And so there is an annual fundraiser. We started, I say we, but no longer we. But while I was there and working for the House of Delegates, we had created a joint fundraiser with Maryland's equivalent of their Legislative Black Caucus. And so a lot of that money is raised to support the members and to help with incumbent protection, as well as attempting to increase the number of Black legislators throughout the Commonwealth. So the mission is kind of the same. I would say the biggest difference is that it is not strictly for Democrats. It is the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. So Black members or members who are a part do not have to be Democrats. It just so happens that they are Democrats. And so they are able to use that fundraising at their discretion in terms of helping with different campaigns during election seasons for members of the House of Delegates, senators, and I believe they also do donations outside of those two as well.
I think it's really important to note that like the House Caucus and the Senate Caucus and the DCCC, DS, DGA, and all these other different groups, they do have a goal of incumbent protection, which oftentimes leads them to get involved in primaries. And when you talk about the overarching idea of the party, oftentimes the state Democratic parties or the DNC or the organized elected bodies get thrown under the bus a little bit, but confused for what are the specific roles of other organizations, and while they're doing their job, it's important to note that we as the state party don't do that, and then to also recognize that's what their goal is, right? They're made up of the elected members of the House delegates or the Virginia Senate or the Black members of the General Assembly in Virginia. Like their job is to protect their members because that's who their constituency is as a whole and as an organization. I know we see a lot on national news about how the DCCC doesn't want to work with vendors who work for candidates who are opposing their incumbents. And that becomes a whole, kerfuffle might be the right word about the party is holding down these vendors. So the party is preventing folks from challenging incumbents when in reality it's the 219 elected Democrats in the House of Representatives aren't really cool with people primarying them and don't want the organization that's made up of them supporting those candidates. And I think it's always just important for folks to take stock of what role each organization has within the ecosystem. And I'm going to channel my inner Chris Bowling, like, for the love of God, let's just get rid of the phrase "the party," because that gets applied in a lot of different places.
Yeah, it does. And one thing that I'll say too is oftentimes, as somebody just said, incumbents also pay dues to those committees. A lot of times they do. There are dues or assessments or some sort of payment that members are expected to make to those committees, and with that comes certain things. A friend of mine who I used to work with in caucuses used to always say, at our core, we're a membership organization. And just like any membership organization, you fight for your members. And going on what Diondra was saying about the Black Caucus, oftentimes you'll also see a Latino caucus. Sometimes you see a congressional, there's the Congressional Progressive Caucus. So you see a lot of other groups that also form caucuses based on a community that they have. Those are all of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. Shyam, Diondra, is there anything that you all want to add before we open it up to see if there's any questions from the group that's joined us tonight? Great. Anybody who's on with us tonight, if you have any questions or follow-ups based on what we've talked about, feel free to unmute yourself or feel free to put it in the chat.
Hey all, Randy Sprinkle here, he, him pronouns. I think another point, and I think we touched on it briefly, would you guys be able to kind of explain the difference between, obviously it's going to be kind of loose structure, but like the coordinated campaign, DPVA, the House caucuses, and the Senate caucus, like kind of their different roles, and how the election season, the primary season.
Yeah, so I'll take a shot at this one, and Shyam and Diondra can correct me where I mess up. So in the primaries, you'll see that the House caucus, the Senate caucus, oftentimes will defend its own members who might be facing a primary challenge, whereas the party, at least in Virginia, stays out of primary challenges. The coordinated campaign normally comes together after primaries. Sometimes it comes together in some fashion beforehand. In 2019, because there was no top of the ticket, we were able to start putting the Virginia coordinated campaign together actually in 2018. We started building that out because there was going to be no top of the ticket primary. It was going to be the state Senate and the state House. So we came together, those two caucuses, along with the party and along with Governor Northam, to form the 2019 coordinated. Sometimes, for example, this year, for the coordinated, mainly you're waiting until the top of the ticket primary is over, because the top of the ticket campaign will be the biggest fundraiser. They will want to drive the coordinated. And so you wait for them, because why get it started? Why start that before the primary? Every state is a little bit different post-primary. In some states, the top of the ticket campaign completely runs the coordinated. There is no input from anybody else. In some states, there is a little more input from the party or from the lower level people on the ballot. It just differs. It also can differ by who the candidate is, by how inclusive they want to be in a coordinated campaign. So you see it all over the place. At the end of the day, the party's job is to elect Democrats, period. The House caucus, the Senate caucus, as a House caucus person, I want to help everybody, but my main objective is the House. So what I'm building, it's for our state House people. Same thing with the state Senate. Coordinated differ. Sometimes they're working to elect everybody. Sometimes, oftentimes, their main priority is top of the ticket and other folks come second. But it all sort of differs. The other thing that you have to think about a lot of times is the coordinated campaign is often run through the state party, and that's because of an issue of being able to set up an organization. As Shyam mentioned, the state party has an infrastructure that already exists, so it's easy to just add the coordinated onto it and sort of run them simultaneously. Diondra, Shyam, anything to add to that one?
I'll just add that I think also keep in mind that this is tiered. So in my experience, campaigns that I've worked on, oftentimes the coordinated effort refers to the field team. I've been on campaigns where I was a direct hire. The candidate chose me, I interviewed with them, and I was hired on in a finance capacity, but our field effort was the portion that was coordinated. And so, I mean, I think it just kind of makes sense structurally because that's where you need a lot of bandwidth and a lot of capacity. And it is easier for the state party to, they already have the infrastructure there. And so they're filling that in. And so that responsibility is taken off of the candidate and the campaign. But in the fundraising capacity, again, in my experience, that's often been a one-on-one hire. So I'm interacting with the party, I'm interacting with the coordinated because I'm fundraising. And so obviously that has to be a part of our communication, but my boss per se was the candidate. And for field, their boss was the coordinated. And so I think people sometimes get a little confused because we're all on one team and we are all working towards one goal. But there are different paths to that goal. And so when people, I think, sometimes hear the coordinated, it's important to emphasize that that could be one portion of the campaign. And oftentimes it tends to be the field outreach effort.
It's also important to recognize this looks completely different in just about every state because not every state holds a primary in June. In some states, you may have a early February primary. In other states, you don't have a primary, you have election and then runoff. And so what that ends up looking like and what their party structure is and how that ties into whatever campaign is at the top of the ticket or down ballot is almost entirely dependent on where you're at and when you're at in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and the one thing that I thought I'd just add in there as well on the end, especially when it comes to legislative caucuses, it goes back to what I was talking about with rural communities and rural committees and sort of setting out what your goals are. Sometimes your goals are the majority, sometimes it's not. In 2015, our goal at the Virginia House Democrats was to break the supermajority, and we did so in 2015. Our friends down the road in Tennessee, they are in super minorities in both chambers. If they were able to just get out of the super minority, I cannot tell you how ecstatically happy they would be. So, those goals change based on what your situation is and where you are. Randy, anything else? Any other questions you have?
I think that really answers it. I have like a billion, of course, because I always have a question if anybody's got a question, but I'll let somebody else put forward one if they have them.
Anybody else on the call, feel free to jump in if you'd like to. All right, well, if there's no other questions, we will wrap up. We're going to post this online. I also just want to say, the three of us that are here tonight, I won't say this for the other two, I'll say it for me. I'm always happy to answer questions people have. I'm always glad to talk to you because oftentimes there is a disconnect between the mechanics of the situation and what you may think is happening. Similar to what Shyam said, you know, the House caucus does something to defend a member and it's reported as the Democratic Party. It actually had nothing to do with the actual Democratic Party. So, you know, there's different things that happen. The other thing that I'll say, just to add on, behind every organization, there are people that put their blood, sweat, and tears into it. So sometimes before you attack an organization or a grouping for something, it's best to know who's there, because oftentimes you are attacking people that have been working very hard for the same objectives you are. And if you don't know them, it'd be good to get to know them, because most of us are decent people. Not all of us. We got some jerks, but most of us are decent people. Shyam, Diondra, anything to say before we sign off?
Just really quickly, as a small caveat, I know sometimes something I personally hear a lot is when people of color are attempting to really gain a foothold in the political realm, and sometimes it's very frustrating. Oftentimes the issues or questions you have are in the process of being addressed. There are a number of resources that are working very hard to make sure that we are creating a more equitable standing in terms of staffing and political campaigns. I am also open. I'm more than willing to share those resources with anyone on here, or answer any questions, or give any insight, or just be a sounding board. So to echo what Trevor said, please do not be afraid to reach out to people. Closed mouths don't get fed. And if you don't voice what it is, you know, your concerns are, people aren't going to know. And oftentimes there is a solution. You just have to be willing to keep knocking on the door. As Trevor said, most of the people, especially in the Commonwealth, are more than willing to help. So please do not be afraid to reach out.
I think I'd just toss in, get involved, go join your local committee, join the central committee, run for something. But, you know, thanks for having me on this, Trevor and Diondra. This was a lot of fun. We should totally turn this into a series. That'd be fun to do all the time. I don't know. It was really nice to be on, and a ton of really good questions.
Awesome. Thank you guys for doing this. We will do this again. Anybody who's watching this after the fact and you didn't have a chance to ask your question, please feel free to ask it. And we'll do this again in the future on other topics. So thanks, everybody. Have a good one.